It's February, the season of everyone getting matched or paired up. So what better excuse to bring up some awesome science fiction pairs or duologies? I have a pair of videos for you about all of the science fiction duologies that I own or know about. I further divided it into duologies that I have completed, duologies that I've started, and duologies that I'm planning to read because I own them. I also want to say that as far as some of these duologies are concerned, quite a few of them got kicked off the list because several authors have admitted that some of their all-time best-selling duologies are going to get a third book. One of the things that I really enjoy about duologies is finding out how the two books are linked. If it's a prequel, if it continues the series with the same characters, or if it's a totally different story. These are all things that I want to know. So I went out of my way to make sure to do some research so you know how the two books are linked. So that way, when you go into reading them, hopefully your expectations can be met.
You complete me.
Let's get into these duologies. Let's start with the Hugo Award-winning Texcalaan series by Arkady Martine. This series consists of Memory called Empire and Desolation called Peace. Both of these books won the Hugo Award each year that they were up for nomination. So it is a series that is highly regarded and highly awarded. And if you for some reason haven't heard of this series, you should maybe pick this up. This series follows Mahit, a newly minted ambassador of a small space colony who's on a journey to the local superpower of the Texcalaan Empire, who is not just starting a new job, she's also investigating the murder of her predecessor. She's navigating the unique and fantastic political landscape of the Texcalaan Empire, which is a weird combination of Byzantine and Aztecs in space with a lot of poetry and rhyming, all while holding a secret and very illegal technology inside her head. This duology was fantastic for its very unique and original world building. It was incredible and very educational. I loved the storyline. I thought that the second book was just a little bit weaker than the first one, but both of them were well worth the read. This is definitely a duology for people who really appreciate world building and are looking for some character-heavy storytelling with a little bit of sapphic romance. The next duology that I've completed is going to be Octavia Butler's Earthseed. Now you know this was coming up, right? I mean, I love me some Octavia Butler. This duology consists of Parable of the Sower and Parable of Talents. Now together, these books all tell a single story, so you do have to read both of them for the complete climax of the story. We follow the life story of Laura Olamina, who is a young black girl growing up watching the environmental and political collapse of the United States, which forces her out of her safe California home into a world of injustice, violence, and social unrest. To get through the terrible world that she is now surviving and finding herself in, she discovers or invents a new religion that allows herself and those around her to take on a new and more hopeful worldview. And what's really unique about the series is that it's not really as much about the religion as it is about what people need to search for meaning, what they require to live in an unjust and violent world, and how people around her respond to these new ideas. In my opinion, this duology was incredibly hopeful, and it was one of my favorite series by Octavia Butler. The next duology that I have completed is The Dogs of War by Adrian Tchaikovsky. These consist of the book Dogs of War, followed by Bearhead. This is a particularly interesting book that takes a look at genetic modification. The first book follows a main character, Rex, who is a genetically modified dog with human intelligence. And he just wants to be a good dog and make his master happy. But as the story goes along, he starts really understanding that some of what he's doing is maybe not the best thing for the people around him. And yet he still struggles because he wants to be a good dog. This series really was very character heavy and really pulled at my heartstrings, but the second book follows the perspective of several members of his team and takes a lot broader approach looking at the consequences of what happened in book 1. I think that book 2 was actually stronger of the two stories. It was a little bit less character-based and a little bit more about the heavy consequences in a global view. So if you are more of a big ideas person, I feel like you might really enjoy book 2 a lot better. And if you want more character-heavy, emotional buildup, you'll definitely enjoy book number 1. Together, this duology makes for a very well-balanced story, and I really recommend it. Next on the list, we have Ernest Cline's Ready Player One and Ready Player Two. Now I know, try not to groan too hard. If for some reason you haven't heard about this series, what you should know is that this is almost a YA series following a teenage boy who is down in the dumps, a poor kid from the stacks who is seeking to solve a decades-old puzzle by a dead billionaire who put a bunch of eccentric puzzles from the 80s and 90s nerd culture out on the internet to solve, and whoever can complete all of the puzzles gets to be his heir to his billionaire company. This book was such a fun romp. It feels like a video game, it feels like virtual reality. It was very action-based and had a lot of nostalgia for the 80s. And even for somebody who, while I was alive in the 80s, I wasn't really taking part in any of the culture at the time, I didn't feel left out. I had a really good time with the first book, and I gotta say, the second book was a huge letdown. I'd like to pretend that it didn't exist, but it does. The second book definitely follows up the consequences of the first book, kind of what happens after you, say, win the lottery. What are you gonna do with all that money? What are you gonna do when you're not striving for a cause? And what happened to our main character and all of his friendly relations? Gotta say, the second book had some glimmers of potential there. There were some cool ideas, but overall was a huge letdown. And in my opinion, the main character was written considerably more whiny and annoying than in the first book.
Where?
I strongly recommend against reading the second book if you really enjoyed the main character in the first. My last duology is a recent read, and that is the Alien Shores duology by C.S. Friedman. This Alien Shore followed by This Virtual Night. What gorgeous covers, huh? Book number 1, in a world where interstellar travel is not only possible, but carries unintended consequences and activates portions of our DNA that we didn't know we had, to creating quite varied, mutated human alien species. In response, Earth panics, and rather than helping those colonists and their children as that they've sent out to explore the galaxy, they instead shut down planet Earth and leave them to their own devices. As you can imagine, this creates a lot of tension between Earth and its wayward, mutated children. But they have had tenuous peace, and that is where our first book starts. We follow a Terran girl named Jamesia who has been experimented on by several Terran agencies and is released into the wild to run for her life by her handlers, trying to piece together both what happened to her, why she was experimented on, and to seek refuge with those alien colonists that were Earth's mutated children, leads to a fun, really intense comforting read. I loved the first book of this duology, and it was really one of those books that made me feel like coming home. It was very reminiscent of Firefall, but interestingly, written before that TV show came out. The second book was a very fun follow-up, and it took place in the same universe as the first book, but had none of the same characters and definitely took place significantly in the future. The only combining, linking features between these two books, besides the universe and the political tensions, was a computer virus introduced in the first book named Lucifer. Now let's move on to the 6 duologies that I have started but not quite finished. Now, one of the things that I really dislike about duologies is that you're not quite sure what links the first and the second books together, so I'm going to make sure to mention a little bit about what links the 2 books together. So be careful if you're somebody who likes to know absolutely nothing about the second book's plot. Because I do need to mention, is it a prequel? Is it the same character? Is it different characters? Let's talk about what links the 2. Because that is sometimes how I decide if I'm going to pick up the second in the series. So the first one on our list is a very popular duology in science fiction, and that is Peter Watt's Firefall duology. This is consisting of the book Blind Sight, followed by Echopraxia. So if you're not familiar with these, this book is essentially a first contact novel that's occurring in the future where space travel requires both AI and it requires a genetically modified human, very similar to space vampires, to be completed. The first book follows the crew of a vessel that has been sent out to investigate what looks like intelligent signal, and they want to discover possible first contact. Well, the first part of that first book was a little bit slow and the pacing was a little bit eerie. What really shined in this book was the latter part of the book where we get to meet the intelligence behind the signal. And we have a lot of really interesting psychological concepts of, can we recognize alien intelligence? We have a lot of questions about consciousness and who we are as humans. And this book was one of those mind-blowing novels that I think about still, even after having read it several years ago. I cannot wait to pick up the second in the series, Echopraxia, which is apparently new characters and has some very mixed reviews. However, this book is supposedly dealing a lot with religion and the question of free will. I liked the first book so much, I definitely have to give the second book at least a try. The next duology here is going to be The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. This one consists of The Sparrow and Children of God. This one follows a very flawed Jesuit priest as he and all of his compatriot friends hear and identify an intelligent life signal that's coming from Alpha Centauri and decide to orchestrate an interstellar traveling journey to go be the ones to have first contact. There is quite a lot of religion in this particular series because we have Jesuit priests who are kind of going on like a missionary type event, but the story concludes with not a whole lot of religious themes, as what happens on the planet really makes every single member of that team question some of their beliefs and ideas. And I'm not just talking about God. I really thought this first book was fantastic. It's one of those books that I have lots of discussions about and really forces you to take a stance on a lot of things that you may have thought you had already decided on. At least that's how I took that book. And I'm really excited to pick up the second in the series because a lot of my friends who have finished it said that the second book really sort of cements that idea in your head that the first one started. However, I do know that a lot of people don't like the second book as much as the first book.
What is the problem with this book?
Nothing.
And there are a lot of middling reviews because it deals with a lot of hard-hitting questions about religion and the philosophy and ethics of that. Now let's move on to another series that I started from my 24 books for 2024, and that is Daniel Suarez's Daemon series. Now I realize that this might be pronounced demon, but it's spelled Daemon, so I'm gonna say Daemon. This duology consists of the book of the same name, Daemon, followed by Freedom. What I found really intense about this book is that it was originally self-published and then later picked up by a publishing company. Fun fact, it begins with a billionaire software engineer genius who dies of a brain tumor, and his death activates a computer program / virus / daemon, one of those computer programs that runs in the background of your computer. And this daemon strategically begins inserting itself around the world into various companies and key infrastructure of the internet, thereby kind of taking over the world.
Of course!
Now, the first book is a very long one, but it really gets into a lot of the political nitty-gritty of some of our software infrastructure, of how this daemon could take over, and we almost see the daemon kind of challenge humanity into trying to make us prove why we should survive. The first book did kind of end a little bit on a cliffhanger. I didn't get quite as much of a satisfaction from that ending, and I think that's because you have to pick up the second book, Freedom, to get that final climax. And you better bet that I definitely will be picking up Freedom in May, or maybe sooner. I really had a good time with Daniel Suarez's prose, and I really feel a little bit smarter after reading a lot of his books, especially because I don't know much about the infrastructure of the software of the world. There was quite a lot of hard science fiction mixed into this novel, and it did remind me of a more serious Ready Player One. The next duology is a little bit more of a lighthearted one, and that is John Scalzi's Locked-In duology. This one consists of Locked In as well as Head On. I also have to note that I did find a small novella that could be in the same universe called Unlocked. However, because it's a novella and because I think it follows different characters, I'm not going to count it. My video, my rules, sorry.
And let's face it, without rules, there's chaos.
This duology is in a near future and is in a post-pandemic world. There is a virus called Hayden's syndrome that swept the world and left about 1% to 2% of the world's population in a paralyzed state that they called locked in. Because of this, technology has advanced a little bit, and we now have robot-like android-style bodies that these real humans can inhabit and carry on their usual day. However, this also makes for particularly perfect criminals. So we follow a detective in this near future world whose entire job it is to solve crimes that these locked-in robot people have committed. While this sounds a little bit far-fetched and a little bit out there, this series really had a lot to say for itself. I really had a good time. Scalzi really did his research about biology and about robotics and had a really strongly prescient way to talk about the world that might be a little too close to home after COVID-19 pandemic. I definitely read the first one and found it to be one of my favorite of Scalzi's work, so I do plan on going ahead and picking up the second book, Head On, which allegedly has new detectives and a new mystery, and it's really only the same world that the first book is in. So if you're interested, definitely consider this one. The next duology is Sea of Rust. This one consists of Sea of Rust and Day Zero. In this duology, we follow Brittle, who is a robotic AI who is coming to terms with the fact that the robots have completely annihilated the human species. And what that means in terms of how good of a person he is and the ethics of that genocide. He also asks a lot of questions like, did humans deserve that? Or what our world looks like without humans. This book also asks some questions about the ethics of genocide and also what our world looks like without humans. And let me give you a hint. It's not a utopia. This was definitely a very character-heavy book, and it was a lot of soft science fiction. People who are new to the genre would really appreciate this book. Book number 2, Day Zero, is actually a prequel talking about how exactly the AI exterminated the human race and all of the events and drama around that. I can't wait to pick this one up, especially because I think it'll be a great little palate cleanser to complete this duology, and I really liked this author's prose. The next one on the list is going to be another famous one that you guys will probably recognize, and that is Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. This consists of both Handmaid's Tale and another book called The Testaments. This is a reproductive dystopian where the world is no longer fertile and there's only a few women out there left who are able to conceive. And so we follow one particular character as all of her rights are stripped, her children and her husband are taken from her, and she is forced to become a handmaid and given in essential sexual slavery to a rich family to bear them children because the wife no longer can. This is a short novel, but it sure packs a punch. And there's definitely a TV show about it. There's all kinds of discussion about it. This is a really worthwhile read if you love some dystopians, especially ones that could possibly happen in our real world. The ending of this book was something that I thought was crystal perfect, chef's kiss perfection. I loved the ending of this book. It is definitely one of my all-time favorite endings. And The Testaments is allegedly an easier story to follow. It's supposedly just as well written and definitely follows different characters. So you should definitely know that before you get into this duology, but I hands down plan on picking up this book hopefully in May. And the last duology on this list is one by Hank Green. This one is a YA science fiction duology, but we gotta have one on here, and that one is The Carls by Hank Green. This duology consists of an absolutely remarkable thing, followed by a beautifully foolish endeavor. I love these titles, don't you? In this first novel, we follow a 23-year-old girl named April who stumbles upon a giant sculpture in the middle of New York City and, mistaking it as a new art installation, films a video on it for her social media post and rapidly becomes viral as she discovers that it is not an art installation, but rather extraterrestrial beings. And she's the first one who happens to film it. This is happening apparently all over the world, and she develops the name The Carls as a joking term. Throughout the novel, she develops sudden and instantaneous social media fame and becomes the expert on the Carls, and all the TV shows want her. While this does take place in a lot of science fiction world, and there is definitely alien first contact, what you're gonna notice about this novel, it's really ultimately about the effects of social media on our culture today and what fame does to people. And it's not all bad, not all good, but it was a really interesting, character-heavy study about one particular girl under these circumstances. I haven't read the second book yet, but apparently the second book happens immediately after the first and follows her best friend Andy from a first-person perspective into the consequences of what happened in the first book. This is definitely a duology series that I'm really interested in because there are a lot of psychology things that are happening in this series that I thought were a little bit advanced for a YA book, although the 23-year-old girl April really does read like a millennial 23-year-old. That does it for all of the 5 duologies I have completed and the 6 duologies that I have half finished. Be sure to mention in the comments down below which of these duologies you're interested in, and until next week.